His principal aim here is to try to get alignment with his allies in the rich industrial democracies before he begins the next meetings, which lead inexorably to his first face-to-face meeting with the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and then ultimately with the President of China, Xi Jinping. What his administration's officials have said is that there's a sequencing of events that he's very deliberately structured, where the sequence really conveys the political purpose, I suppose. He convened, as you know, Bev, the summit of the Quad democracies for the first time in March. That's Australia, India, Japan, the US. Then he held his first face-to-face meetings with foreign leaders were with the Prime Minister of Japan, a treaty ally in Asia, followed by a face-to-face meeting with Moon, the President of South Korea, another treaty ally of the US in Asia, then the G7, then the G20, the G7, and then NATO, and then the EU, and then Vladimir Putin.
So is this lining up all his traditional allies, all the traditional allies, with regards to China being the end game and China's role now globally?
Yes, it is. But Biden himself has said that the competition, the rivalry with China is the defining task for the US and its allies. He said in March that the US wants to gather Europe and Asia together with the US and Canada to come together to oppose China's coercive activities. That's Joe Biden's words.
And are we seeing countries within Europe itself, the UK, shifting what had been very strong alliances with China, very strong economic partnerships with China?
Just last December, the European Union concluded a pretty major investment deal with Beijing, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, it was called, CAI. And that was only in December, and that was at the end of 7 years of negotiations. But just a few months later, we saw the European Parliament refuse to ratify that deal. The reason being that the European Parliament had put some sanctions on Chinese officials who were presiding over the mass repression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, in return for which China put some sanctions on European members of Parliament, at which point the European Parliament said, we are not going to deal with this situation. We're going to freeze the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. That's a pretty big threshold that the European Parliament has now crossed. And we see increasingly critical comments as well coming from Europe, speaking up against China's human rights abuses.
So how do you think that might impact China's behaviour? We saw them again saying it was a provocation for the US to send vaccines to Taiwan. They, wrap us over the knuckles at any opportunity. So how might it give China pause if they are able to, if the US is able, through its allies, to shift these to shift the global apex as it's been for the last couple of years, all in China's favour?
Well, it's true that the trajectory of sentiment and political movement in the US and Europe and, as you say, the US traditional allies has been to harden the stance, collective stance against China because of China's increasingly assertive and aggressive positions around the world. Now, perhaps Xi Jinping sees and comprehends this because he said in a speech just a few days ago that China needs to project a more credible and lovable image to the world. His words, credible and lovable image to the world. And yet at the same time, in the same week, we saw an unprecedented intrusion or near intrusion of Chinese military aircraft into the Malaysian zone, prompting a formal rebuke from the Malaysian government. We see that when citizens turn out in Hungary to oppose a planned $2 billion building of a Chinese university, a branch of Fudan University in the middle of the capital, that the Chinese government calls it contemptible and just sort of dismisses the entire thing as some sort of political stitch-up. The rhetoric remains as strident as ever. even if the president himself is calling for a more lovable image for China, none of the policy behaviour around the world seems to have softened, even right up to this week.
Yeah, it makes you think it's really hard for China to alter that image to a lovable China when they are being so aggressive on the world stage. How firm do you think these alliances might become in coming months and years to ensure that China is kept at bay, to potentially, even if the bluster continues, not to necessarily follow through on some of the punishments?
Well, 2 points I'd make, Bev. One is that what we're going to see Joe Biden attempt at this G7 is not only to get a unified position criticising China on human rights abuses and use of economic coercion. And because Scott Morrison will be a guest at that G7, we can be sure that Australian officials right now are working to try to get the communique and the language at that G7 summit to be as harshly opposed to economic coercion and trade sanctions as possible. But Joe Biden's also going to try and get that G7 to craft some measures to assist infrastructure building in the developing world, which is directly designed to be a check or a competition, perhaps, with China's Belt and Road infrastructure project, which does the same thing. So that's already underway. But the second point I'd make, Bev, is that it's only Beijing's aggression that has brought so many countries together in shared concern, and it's only Chinese aggression that will make those countries take a firmer stance. Most democracies just want to live a pleasant time and be left alone. They don't want to have to come together and confront aggression. But what we're seeing is that they will if they must.
Good to talk, Pete. Thank you so much.
Pleasure, Bev.